Son discovers dad's secret family while fixing car GPS. Christmas dinner confrontation reveals shocking truth. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. When James volunteered to fix his father's faulty GPS, he never imagined it would lead him down a path of shocking discoveries. As he unravels a web of secrets that threatens to tear his family apart, James must confront the truth about his father's double life. With tensions rising and emotions running high, the upcoming Christmas dinner becomes the stage for an explosive confrontation that will change their lives forever. What truths will come to light, and can this family survive the revelation of a lifetime of lies? The acrid smell of motor oil filled James Anderson's nostrils as he leaned over the open hood of his father's weathered Chevy Impala. The late autumn chill nipped at his exposed fingers, but the 24-year-old mechanic barely noticed, his attention wholly focused on the task at hand. It was a Saturday afternoon in the suburbs of Boston, and the quiet neighborhood hummed with the distant sound of leaf blowers and children playing. "How's it looking, son?" Robert Anderson called out from the garage doorway, a steaming mug of coffee clutched in his calloused hands. James straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Almost done, Dad. Just gotta reconnect a few wires, and she'll be purring like a kitten again." Robert nodded approvingly, a proud smile playing on his lips. "That's my boy. Don't know what I'd do without you." As James returned to his work, he couldn't help but feel a warm glow of satisfaction. He'd always been good with his hands, a trait he'd inherited from his father. Robert Anderson was a respected contractor in the area, known for his impeccable work ethic and attention to detail. James had grown up watching his father build and fix things, and it had sparked a passion that led him to pursue a career as a mechanic. The familiar routine of tinkering with engines was comforting, especially given the tumultuous year James had endured. A nasty breakup with his long-term girlfriend, Sarah, had left him reeling, and he'd thrown himself into his work as a coping mechanism. His parents had been pillars of support during this time, with his mother, Linda, always ready with a home-cooked meal and words of encouragement. As James finished up the last of the repairs, he noticed the GPS unit on the dashboard blinking erratically. "Hey, Dad," he called out. "Looks like your GPS is on the fritz too. Want me to take a look?" Robert hesitated for a moment, an odd expression flitting across his face. "Oh, that old thing? Don't worry about it, son. I hardly use it anyway." But James was already reaching for the unit. "It'll only take a minute. Might as well fix it while I'm here, right?" Robert opened his mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. "Sure, why not?" he said, his voice strained. I'll go see if your mother needs any help with dinner." As his father retreated into the house, James frowned, puzzled by the older man's sudden change in demeanor. Shrugging it off, he turned his attention to the GPS. It didn't take long for him to identify the problem: a loose connection in the wiring. As he worked to repair it, the unit suddenly sprang to life, the screen illuminating with a map. James was about to power it down when something caught his eye. There, saved in the recent destinations, was an address he didn't recognize. 42 Maple Street, Concord. It wasn't just the unfamiliarity of the address that gave him pause. It was the frequency with which it appeared in the history. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past several months. Like clockwork. A niggling sense of unease began to creep up James's spine. His father was a creature of habit, rarely deviating from his usual routines. This regular trip to an unknown location seemed wildly out of character. For a brief moment, James considered the possibility of a work-related explanation, but he quickly dismissed it. His father always shared details about his projects, often seeking James's input on various aspects of construction. Before he could stop himself, James found his fingers moving across the screen, pulling up more information about the mysterious address. The GPS obligingly provided a street view image of a modest two-story house with a well-manicured lawn. It looked like a typical suburban home, nothing out of the ordinary, and yet, something about it made James's heart race. He glanced towards the house, half expecting to see his father watching him from a window. But the curtains remained still, no sign of movement within. Taking a deep breath, James made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He quickly jotted down the address on a scrap of paper and pocketed it, his mind already formulating a plan. As he walked into the house, the smell of his mother's famous pot roast filled the air. Linda Anderson greeted him with a warm smile, her apron dusted with flour. "All done with the car, sweetie?" James nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Good as new." "That's wonderful," Linda beamed. "Your father's always saying what a gift you have with machines." Speaking of your father, he seemed a bit distracted when he came in. "Is everything all right?" James felt a pang of guilt at the concern in his mother's voice. "I'm sure it's nothing," he reassured her, even as doubts gnawed at him. "Probably just stressed about work." As they sat down to dinner that evening, James couldn't help but study his father more closely. Robert seemed his usual self, discussing local politics with enthusiasm and praising Linda's cooking. But now, armed with his newfound knowledge, James noticed the slight tension in his father's shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally darted to the clock on the wall. That night, as James lay in bed in his childhood room, sleep eluded him. The address on Maple Street burned in his mind like a branded mark. He knew he should let it go, respect his father's privacy. But the frequency of the visits, the secrecy surrounding them, it all pointed to something more than a simple work engagement or a friend in need. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, James made up his mind. He would drive to Concord and see for himself what awaited him at 42 Maple Street. Little did he know, the answers he sought would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family. The drive to Concord felt both interminable and far too short for James's liking. Each mile that passed beneath the wheels of his beat-up Ford brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The autumn landscape blurred past his windows, a riot of reds and golds that seemed to mock the turmoil in his heart. As he approached Maple Street, James felt his palms grow sweaty on the steering wheel. He'd rehearsed a dozen scenarios in his head, each more implausible than the last. Was his father involved in some sort of illegal business? Was he secretly caring for a sick relative? Or was it something far more personal, something that could tear their family apart? The GPS chirped, announcing his arrival at the destination. James slowly pulled up to the curb, his eyes fixed on the house he'd seen in the Street View image. In person, it looked even more ordinary. A tidy Cape Cod-style home with navy shutters and a red front door. A silver Subaru sat in the driveway, and cheerful flower boxes adorned the windows. For a long moment, James sat in his car, debating his next move. He'd come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the vehicle and approached the front door. His heart pounded in his ears as he raised his hand to knock. Before his knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door swung open. A woman in her early 50s stood there, her auburn hair streaked with gray and her green eyes widening in surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. James froze, his prepared speech evaporating from his mind. I'm looking for Robert Anderson," he managed to stammer out. The woman's expression changed instantly, a mix of shock and something that looked unsettlingly like recognition flashing across her face. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh my, you must be James." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. How did this stranger know his name? James felt his legs grow weak, and he must have swayed because the woman quickly reached out to steady him. "Why don't you come inside?" she offered, her voice gentle. "I think we have a lot to talk about." In a daze, James followed her into a cozy living room. Family photos adorned the walls, and with a jolt, he realized his father's face was prominently featured in many of them. But it wasn't just Robert. There was a teenage girl in several pictures, her features a striking blend of the woman before him and his father. "My name is Evelyn," the woman said, gesturing for James to take a seat on the floral-patterned couch. "And I think you've figured out by now that I know your father." James sank onto the couch, his mind reeling. How long?" he managed to ask. Evelyn's eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and compassion. Robert and I met 20 years ago at a construction convention in Chicago. We fell in love. But he was already married to your mother, and I was going through a divorce. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. We tried to end it, we really did, but we couldn't stay away from each other. When I found out I was pregnant with Melissa, your father, he wanted to do right by both families. James felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. A half-sister. He had a half-sister he'd never known about. Does my mom know? Evelyn shook her head. No, she doesn't. Robert's been living this double life for almost 2 decades now. He spends most of his time with you and your mother, but he's here with us every Tuesday and Thursday, and every other weekend. As if on cue, the front door opened, and a cheerful voice called out, "Mom, I'm home." A moment later, a girl who could only be Melissa bounded into the room. She stopped short at the sight of James, her eyes, so like their father's, widening in surprise. "Mel, honey," Evelyn said softly. "This is James. He's your brother." Melissa's backpack hit the floor with a thud. "What?" she gasped, looking between her mother and James. But Dad said." "I know, sweetheart," Evelyn soothed. "It's complicated. Why don't you go up to your room for a bit while James and I talk?" As Melissa reluctantly retreated upstairs, James felt a surge of anger rising within him. How could his father have kept this secret for so long? How could he have lied to all of them? To his wife, to his son, even to this other family he'd created. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert, your father, he always said he would tell you someday. He just never found the right moment." James stood up abruptly, unable to bear the weight of these revelations any longer. "I have to go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I need to think." Evelyn nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, but James, please don't judge your father too harshly. He's tried his best to be there for all of us. It hasn't been easy for anyone." As James stumbled back to his car, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and an odd sense of loss, as though the father he thought he knew had suddenly ceased to exist. He sat behind the wheel, staring blankly at the house that contained the secret life of his father's. The upcoming Christmas dinner, usually a time of joy and family togetherness, now loomed before him like a ticking time bomb. How could he possibly sit across the table from his father, knowing what he knew? How could he look into his mother's eyes and not blurt out the truth? As he finally pulled away from the curb, James made a decision. He wouldn't confront his father right away. No, he would wait until Christmas. Let his father enjoy one last holiday with his facade intact. And then, surrounded by twinkling lights and the scent of pine, James would shatter the illusion of their perfect family once and for all. Little did he know, the confrontation he was planning would unearth even more shocking truths that would force everyone involved to re-examine their understanding of love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a blur for James. Each day felt like an elaborate charade, with him struggling to maintain a facade of normalcy around his parents. Every laugh, every casual conversation with his father now seemed tainted by the weight of his newfound knowledge. James threw himself into his work at the garage, staying late most nights, grateful for the distraction. His co-workers noticed the change in him, the dark circles under his eyes and his uncharacteristic quietness, but they chalked it up to lingering heartbreak over his ex-girlfriend. One particularly cold evening in mid-December, as James was closing up shop, he received an unexpected text message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made his heart race. "Hey, it's Melissa. Mom gave me your number. Can we talk?" James stared at the screen, his mind whirling. His half-sister wanted to talk. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to pretend this alternate reality didn't exist. But a stronger part, the part that had always valued honesty and family above all else, made him reply, "Sure, When and where? They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in a neighboring town, neutral ground for both of them. As James walked into the cozy cafe 2 days later, he spotted Melissa immediately. She looked so much like their father that it made his chest ache. "Hi," Melissa said nervously as he approached her table. "Thanks for meeting me." James nodded, sitting down across from her. "Yeah, well, I guess we have a lot to talk about." Over steaming cups of coffee, the half-siblings began to tentatively share their stories. Melissa, it turned out, had always known about James and Linda. "Dad never hid it from me," she explained, her fingers fidgeting with a sugar packet. "He always said I had a big brother, but that it was complicated. I used to imagine what you were like. You know?" James felt a lump form in his throat. "I wish I'd known about you," he said softly. "All those years. We could have been friends." Melissa's eyes welled up with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know this must be so hard for you, finding out about us, about Dad's other life." As they continued to talk, James found himself warming to Melissa. She was sharp-witted and kind, with a passion for environmental science that reminded him of their father's love for building things. By the time they said goodbye, exchanging awkward but heartfelt hugs, James felt a glimmer of something he hadn't expected, a sense of connection to this sister he never knew he had. But as he drove home, the anger and betrayal came flooding back. How could his father have deprived him of knowing his sister? How could he have lied to them all for so long? The Christmas decorations adorning the houses he passed seemed to mock him, their cheerful lights a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. As he pulled into his parents' driveway, he made a decision. He wouldn't wait until Christmas dinner to confront his father. He needed answers now. Taking a deep breath, James walked into the house, the scent of his mother's Christmas baking filling the air. He found his parents in the living room, decorating the tree as they did every year. "James!" Linda exclaimed, her face lighting up. "You're just in time to help with the ornaments." But James couldn't bring himself to play along anymore. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "we need to talk. Now." Robert froze, a delicate glass ornament dangling from his fingers. Something in James's tone must have alerted him because the color drained from his face. "What's wrong, son?" "I know about Evelyn," James said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know about Melissa. I know everything." The ornament slipped from Robert's grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. Linda looked between her husband and son, confusion etched on her face. "What's going on? Who are Evelyn and Melissa?" And just like that, the carefully constructed facade of the Anderson family began to crumble. The silence that followed James's revelation was deafening. Linda's eyes darted between her son and her husband, confusion giving way to dawning horror as she took in Robert's stricken expression. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is James talking about?" Robert sank heavily onto the couch, his head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and resignation. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." What followed was a painful recounting of the past 20 years. Robert spoke of meeting Evelyn, of the affair that he couldn't seem to end, of the daughter he'd fathered. With each word, Linda seemed to physically shrink, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. James stood by, a maelstrom of emotions churning within him. Part of him wanted to comfort his mother, to shield her from this devastating truth. But another part, the part still reeling from his own sense of betrayal, couldn't bring himself to move. "How could you?" Linda finally managed to choke out, tears streaming down her face. 20 years, Robert. 20 years of lies." Robert reached out to her, but she flinched away from his touch. "I love you, Linda," he pleaded. "I've always loved you. I couldn't bear to hurt either of you." James let out a bitter laugh. "Well, great job with that, Dad, because we're all hurting now." As the night wore on, more painful truths came to light. Robert had been supporting Evelyn and Melissa financially all these years, explaining away the extra expenses as business costs. He'd missed countless family events, claiming work emergencies when he was really with his other family. Linda, her voice hoarse from crying, turned to James. "How did you find out?" James explained about the GPS, the mysterious address, his impromptu trip to Concord. With each detail, Robert seemed to age before their eyes, the weight of his deceit finally crushing down upon him. "I wanted to tell you both, so many times," Robert said, his voice breaking. "But I was a coward. I convinced myself that keeping it a secret was protecting everyone." "Protecting everyone?" James exploded, years of pent-up anger suddenly boiling over. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom? To me? Hell, even to Melissa and Evelyn? You've been lying to all of us." Robert flinched at his son's words but didn't argue. "You're right," he said softly. "I've made a mess of everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but please believe me when I say I love all of you. I never meant to cause so much pain." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the Anderson family sat in exhausted silence. The Christmas tree stood half-decorated, a poignant reminder of the joy and normalcy that had been shattered in a single night. Linda, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, finally spoke. "I need some time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't process all of this right now. I think you should leave, Robert." Robert nodded, defeat etched in every line of his face. As he slowly gathered some belongings, James felt a confusing mix of anger and pity for his father. This man, who he'd idolized for so long, suddenly seemed small and fallible. Before Robert left, he turned to James. "Son, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please look out for your mother, and if you can find it in your heart, don't shut Melissa out. She's innocent in all this." James couldn't bring himself to respond, watching silently as his father walked out the door, leaving behind the wreckage of 2 decades of lies. As the door closed, Linda let out a heart-wrenching sob. James moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her shaking form. "It's going to be okay, Mom," he murmured, wishing he could believe his own words. But as they sat there, surrounded by the remnants of their shattered family life, James couldn't help but wonder, how could anything ever be okay again? And what would happen when the rest of the family arrived for Christmas dinner, expecting the usual holiday cheer? Little did they know, the revelations of that night were just the beginning. The upcoming Christmas gathering would bring to light even more shocking truths, forcing everyone to confront their own roles in the complex web of secrets and lies that had ensnared them all. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a haze of tension and unspoken words. Linda moved through the house like a ghost, mechanically going through the motions of holiday preparations. James found himself torn between anger at his father and an overwhelming need to protect his mother from further pain. As Christmas Eve arrived, the Anderson household was a far cry from its usual festive cheer. The decorated tree stood as a mocking reminder of happier times, its lights twinkling obliviously in the corner of the living room. "Maybe we should cancel dinner," James suggested gently, watching his mother stare blankly at a half-frosted cookie sheet. "We could tell everyone you're not feeling well." Linda shook her head, a spark of determination flickering in her tired eyes. "No," she said firmly. "I won't let Robert's choices ruin our family traditions. We're having Christmas dinner, and that's final." James nodded, admiring his mother's strength even as he worried about the emotional toll this facade was taking on her. As he helped her finish the preparations, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Melissa. "Merry Christmas Eve, big brother. I hope you're doing okay. I'm here if you need to talk." James stared at the message, conflicting emotions swirling within him. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend Melissa didn't exist. But a larger part, the part that had begun to care for this newfound sister, made him type out a reply. "Merry Christmas Eve to you too. It's tough, but we're hanging in there. Thanks for checking in." As evening fell, the doorbell rang, heralding the arrival of the extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins poured in, arms laden with gifts and dishes for the potluck dinner. James watched as his mother plastered on a smile, greeting everyone with forced cheer. "Where's Robert?" Aunt Susan asked, looking around expectantly. "Don't tell me he's working on Christmas Eve." Linda's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Oh, you know Robert," she said, her voice overly bright. "Last-minute business emergency. He'll be here soon." James felt a surge of anger at his father for putting them in this position, for forcing them to lie to protect his secrets. As he helped set the table, he overheard snippets of conversation, his relatives speculating about Robert's absence and commenting on the unusual tension in the air. Just as they were about to sit down to dinner, the front door opened. James felt his heart drop as he saw his father step into the house, looking haggard and uncertain. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Robert. Linda froze, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a moment, James thought she might break down or order Robert to leave. Instead, she squared her shoulders and addressed the room. "Well, look who finally made it," she said, her voice tight. "Now we can start dinner." As they gathered around the table, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. James could see the confusion on his relatives' faces, sensing that something was terribly wrong but unable to put their finger on it. Robert cleared his throat, raising his glass. "Before we begin, I'd like to say something," he started, his voice shaky. James tensed, wondering if his father was about to confess everything in front of the entire family. But Linda cut him off sharply. "I don't think that's necessary, Robert," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Let's just enjoy our meal, shall we?" The dinner that followed was a masterclass in uncomfortable silences and stilted conversation. James found himself fielding questions about his father's strange behavior and his mother's obvious distress. He deflected as best he could, all the while feeling the weight of the secrets pressing down on him. As the dessert plates were being cleared away, Aunt Susan cornered James in the kitchen. "What's really going on, James?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "I've known your parents for 30 years, and I've never seen them like this." James opened his mouth, unsure of what to say, when a commotion from the living room caught their attention. They rushed back to find Linda standing in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face, Robert reaching out to her helplessly. "I can't do this anymore," Linda cried, her voice cracking. "I can't pretend everything's fine when our entire life has been a lie." And just like that, the carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. The silence that followed Linda's outburst was deafening. Every eye in the room was fixed on the distraught woman, expressions ranging from shock to confusion to growing concern. Robert stepped forward, his face a mask of regret and shame. "Linda, please," he began, but she cut him off with a look of such raw pain that he fell silent. "No, Robert," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "No more lies, no more secrets. They deserve to know the truth. All of it." James moved to stand beside his mother, offering silent support as she took a deep breath and addressed the stunned gathering of relatives. "For the past 20 years, Linda began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "Robert has been living a double life. He has another family, a woman named Evelyn and a daughter, Melissa." The room erupted into gasps and exclamations of disbelief. Aunt Susan's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Uncle Tom, Robert's brother, stood up abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "Is this true, Robert?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Robert, looking older and more defeated than James had ever seen him, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's true." What followed was a painful recounting of the past 2 decades. The affair, the secret family, the years of lies and deception. As Robert spoke, James watched the faces of his relatives, seeing shock give way to anger, disappointment, and in some cases, a terrible understanding. "How could you do this to Linda?" Aunt Susan cried, tears streaming down her face. "To James? To all of us?" Robert had no answer, his shoulders slumped in defeat. James felt a confusing mix of emotions, anger at his father, pity for the broken man before him, and a fierce protectiveness towards his mother. As the initial shock began to wear off, the questions started. How did James find out? Why now? What would happen next? James found himself explaining about the GPS, the trip to Concord, the meeting with Melissa. With each word, he saw understanding dawn on his relatives' faces. Pieces of a puzzle they hadn't even known existed falling into place. So, what now? Uncle Tom asked, his earlier anger tempered by a weary sadness. Where do we go from here? Linda, who had been silent since her initial revelation, spoke up. I don't know, she admitted, her voice small but steady. But I do know that I can't simply go back to the way things were. Too much has happened. Too many lies have been told. Robert stepped towards her, his hand outstretched. Linda, please, he begged. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I love you. I've always loved you. For a moment, the room held its breath, watching as Linda stared at her husband's outstretched hand. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Love isn't enough, Robert, she said softly. Not anymore. As the night wore on, the gathering that had started as a cheerful family Christmas dinner transformed into an impromptu family council. Sides were taken, opinions voiced, and through it all, James found himself in the strange position of mediator, trying to keep the peace even as his own emotions roiled within him. It was past midnight when the last of the relatives finally left, each hug at the door lingering a little longer than usual, each goodbye weighted with unspoken concern and support. As James closed the door behind Aunt Susan, the last to leave, he turned to find his parents standing in the living room, the physical distance between them a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. I think, Linda said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, that we need to talk about where we go from here. All of us, including Evelyn and Melissa. Robert's head snapped up, hope and fear warring in his eyes. You want to meet them? Linda nodded slowly. I think I need to, for closure if nothing else. James felt a surge of admiration for his mother's strength and dignity in the face of such betrayal. I'll be there with you, Mom, he said firmly. Whatever you decide, whatever happens next, I'm here. As they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of their Christmas celebration, half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, the twinkling lights of the tree, James couldn't help but wonder what the new year would bring. The foundations of their family had been shaken to the core, and the path forward was unclear. But as he looked at his mother, standing tall despite the weight of her pain, and his father, broken but finally honest, James felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with truth as their guide. Little did they know, the meeting that lay ahead would bring revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, forgiveness, and the complex nature of love. The days following Christmas passed in a blur of tense conversations and sleepless nights. James found himself in the surreal position of arranging a meeting between his mother and his father's secret family. Evelyn had been surprisingly receptive to the idea, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and relief when James called to set it up. On a cold, gray afternoon in early January, James drove his mother to a small, neutral cafe in a neighboring town. Linda sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of determination. Are you sure about this, Mom? James asked as he parked the car. Linda took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. No, she admitted, but I need to do this. I need to see them to understand. As they walked into the cafe, James immediately spotted Evelyn and Melissa at a corner table. His father sat with them, looking uncomfortable and out of place. The sight of the four of them together, his two families colliding, made James's stomach churn. Introductions were awkward and stilted. Evelyn, her face pale and drawn, shook Linda's hand with a murmured apology. Melissa, looking like she wanted to disappear, offered a timid hello to the woman her father had been married to all her life. For a long moment, no one seemed to know what to say. Then Linda, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, broke the silence. I'm not here for apologies or explanations, she said, addressing both Robert and Evelyn. I'm here because I need to understand how this happened, how we all got to this point. What followed was a painful, honest conversation that lasted for hours. Robert, his voice heavy with regret, recounted how the affair had begun, how he'd found himself torn between two lives, unable to let go of either. Evelyn, tears streaming down her face, spoke of her own guilt and shame. I never meant to break up a family, she said softly. I told Robert so many times to go back to you, to end things with us. But I was weak. We both were. As the story unfolded, James found himself looking at Melissa, seeing the pain and confusion in her eyes. She hadn't asked for any of this, he realized. Like him, she was a victim of their parents' choices. But it was Linda who surprised them all. As Robert and Evelyn finished their explanations, she leaned forward, her eyes intense. I won't pretend that hearing all of this doesn't hurt, she said. It does more than I can express. But sitting here, looking at all of you, I realize something. We're all victims of this situation, in our own ways. She turned to Melissa, her voice softening. You didn't ask to be born into this complicated mess. And you, she said, addressing Evelyn, you fell in love with a man who wasn't free to love you back fully. I can't condone what you did, but I can understand the pain you must have felt. Robert looked at his wife in astonishment. Linda, I don't deserve your understanding, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. This isn't about what you deserve, Robert, she said firmly. This is about finding a way forward. For all of us. As the meeting drew to a close, no firm decisions had been made about the future. But something had shifted. The air felt clearer, the burden of secrets lifted. Outside the cafe, as they prepared to leave, Melissa approached James hesitantly. I know this is all messed up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm glad I finally got to meet you, to meet Linda. You're both so much kinder than I had any right to expect. James felt a lump form in his throat. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a connection to this young woman who was, after all, his sister. This isn't your fault, Melissa, he said gently. And whatever happens next, your family. That doesn't change. As they drove home, Linda sat quietly, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive Robert, she said softly, but I think I can find a way to move forward. For all of us. James reached over and squeezed his mother's hand, marveling at her strength and grace in the face of such betrayal. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together. The months that followed were a period of profound change and adjustment for the Anderson family. Robert moved out of the family home, renting a small apartment nearby. Linda, with the support of a therapist and her close friends, began the difficult process of rebuilding her life as an individual, separate from the identity she'd held as Robert's wife for so long. James found himself in the unexpected role of family mediator, bridging the gap between his parents and fostering a tentative relationship with Melissa. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger and hurt threatened to overwhelm him. But there were also moments of surprising connection and even laughter. As spring bloomed, bringing new life to the world around them, the extended Anderson family gathered for a picnic in the park. It was Melissa's idea, a neutral ground where they could all come together without the weight of household memories. Linda arrived with a basket of her famous fried chicken, a peace offering of sorts. Evelyn brought a homemade apple pie, her hands shaking slightly as she set it on the picnic table. Robert, looking older but somehow lighter, helped James set up lawn chairs and a badminton net. As they settled in to eat, James couldn't help but marvel at the scene before him. His mother and Evelyn, chatting quietly over shared recipes. Melissa, shyly showing Linda photos from her recent science fair victory. Robert, watching it all with a mix of sadness and gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't perfect. The pain of betrayal still lingered, the trust shattered by years of lies still fragile and uncertain. But there was also a new understanding, a hard-won wisdom that came from facing difficult truths head-on. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself sitting next to his father, watching as Melissa taught Linda how to play badminton. "I never thought I'd see this," Robert said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "All of us together like this. I don't deserve it." James was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Maybe it's not about deserving, Dad," he finally said. "Maybe it's about choosing to move forward, to build something new out of the wreckage of the old." Robert nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I've lost so much," he said. "Your mother's trust, your respect. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." "I know, Dad," James replied, "and I can't promise it'll ever be the same. But we're here, aren't we? That's a start." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, James looked around at this unconventional gathering. His mother, laughing at something Melissa had said. Evelyn helping Robert pack up the leftover food. It wasn't the family he'd grown up with, nor was it one he could have ever imagined. But it was family, nonetheless. Broken and rebuilt, held together by threads of forgiveness, understanding, and the choice to move forward together. As they said their goodbyes, hugs were exchanged, tentative at first, then warmer. Linda surprised everyone by pulling Melissa into a tight embrace. "You're always welcome in our lives," she whispered to the young woman. "None of this was your fault." Driving home with his mother, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly. Linda smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I am," she said. "It's not the life I expected, and there's still a lot of healing to do. But I think we're going to be all right." James nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it together, with honesty and compassion as their guides. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, James realized something profound. Family wasn't just about blood or marriage. It was about choice. The choice to love, to forgive, to rebuild. And in the face of life's most challenging moments, that choice could create something beautiful out of even the most painful truths. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.